The neuromuscular junction is a connection between a neuron and a muscle cell. So what occurs at the neuromuscular junction is in essence a cell-to-cell communication. What we see here in panel A is more of the cellular level, where we have the axon of a somatic motor neuron. Somatic motor neurons are the neurons of your nervous system that control skeletal muscle contraction. You'll notice that this neuron has myelin. This is what's called myelin. We'll talk more about that when we get to the nervous system. But what that'll do is speed up the electrical conduction in the neuron. So this neuron originates somewhere either from your brain directly to a skeletal muscle or from your brain down the spinal cord and then out to a skeletal muscle. So this is the terminal end of the axon. And at the end of the axons are enlargements called synaptic end bulbs. At the other end of the connection is the muscle cell. So here we have that long cylindrical skeletal muscle cell. Inside that skeletal muscle cell we see the myofibrils. Those myofibrils are made up of sarcomeres, and we hopefully already are getting to understand how a sarcomere works. So what we're really doing now is looking at the communication between the synaptic end bulb and the skeletal muscle. That collectively is known as a neuromuscular junction. You're going to see the word synaptic or synapse quite a bit. But what a synapse is a region where communication occurs between cells. So this is a synapse, a connection. If we expand on that synapse, we now see a nerve impulse represented by this arrow traveling down the axon. The next step is to open up calcium channels. There are little calcium channels called voltage-gated calcium channels that are located in the synaptic end bulb membrane. What those channels do is in response to a voltage, which is the action potential, they open and allow calcium ions to travel into the end bulb. Calcium is extremely important at this step. Calcium is involved in allowing exocytosis. So inside the end bulb, there are tiny little vesicles called synaptic vesicles. And inside those vesicles, which are in essence little containers, are the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a very common neurotransmitter. It's used throughout the nervous system. It's also used at the neuromuscular junction. It is the chemical messenger that gets released from the neuron in order to tell the muscle cell it's time to contract. When these synaptic vesicles get enough calcium, they attach to the membrane and release the neurotransmitter in a little space in between the neuron and muscle. That space in between the neuron and muscle is called the synaptic cleft, or synaptic space. The neurotransmitter, shown here as these small little red pyramids, so we can enlarge that view and see the little acetylcholine molecules are getting released from the neuron by exocytosis. They're going to diffuse across the synaptic cleft and attach to acetylcholine receptors, which are located on the skeletal muscle cell. The region where we find these is often referred to as the motor end plate. That's just the region of the muscle cell opposite the neuron that contains acetylcholine receptors. Once the acetylcholine binds to the receptors, shown here in green, these receptors are actually channels, ion channels. And what they allow is a large increase in sodium entering the muscle cell. That's an extremely important event. Sodium is positively charged. And when you get a lot of positive charges entering a muscle cell, that triggers what we call the muscle action potential, which is an electrical change in the muscle cell. We had one in the neuron called the neuron action potential, or nerve impulse. Here we have an electrical change in the skeletal muscle cell. And it's that large increase in sodium which is ultimately going to cause the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which we already know what happens next. After that calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it binds to troponin, and we get that actin-myosin cross bridge and contraction to occur. So these are the important events at the neuromuscular junction. Once we know that, we can put everything together. Before we try to put everything together, I want to make sure that you go to Canvas and watch the animation. There's an animation that goes over the things I just discussed. It's going to look much like this drawing, and then it's going to step through this process from the nerve impulse all the way until acetylcholine triggers sodium influx into the muscle cell. Now there's an important enzyme that is used to get rid of the acetylcholine. And there's a minor typo, so I'm going to change that right now. The enzyme is known as acetylcholinesterase. Acetylcholinesterase removes acetylcholine from the synaptic cleft. So this enzyme is extremely important for relaxation or to prevent overcontraction. So it's an enzyme that gets rid of the acetylcholine, preventing continued muscle fiber contraction in the absence of neuron stimulation. So you can imagine if the acetylcholine is being released and stimulating the muscle, how do you stop that in order to get the muscle to relax? Well, you have to remove that acetylcholine using this enzyme, acetylcholinesterase. The animation will mention that enzyme as well. Here's where we put everything together. This is kind of an all-encompassing review. There's a number of animations, again, on Canvas. These are the more fancy animations that are really jazzed up with a lot of effects. So I would hold off on watching these animations until you have a fairly decent understanding of the process. This figure you can walk through, starting with the neuron and the neuromuscular junction, all the way until you get contraction, these sarcomeres contracting, and then you can go and look at relaxation. So this is a very good figure to walk through it step by step. Use your book, use this PowerPoint, and go from all the way from a neuron sending a nerve impulse to muscle contraction, back to muscle relaxation. Finally, once we know a little bit about the neuromuscular junction, we can talk about interesting things like Botox and some other agents that work at the neuromuscular junction. I'm going to save these for the next video.